Welcome back to the Canadian Real Estate Channel. I'm Adam J.D. Martin, your host, and today we're going to be talking about whether or not it's time to exit your short-term rentals. For the last few years, I've been investing in real estate in all sorts of strategies. I've had student rentals, I've house hacked, I've done creative financing on a bunch of deals, I've done long-term rentals, I've done multifamily investing, and I've also had a few short-term rentals. I even tried the re-rental strategy, but the last few years, things have kind of changed in this market, and I'm starting to wonder if it's actually time to exit those short-term rentals and focus more either on long-term rentals, multifamily investing, bigger buildings, or simply just getting out of the short-term rental business to begin with. I'm of the opinion that the market's changed. It's not the glory days that it used to be. When I started using Airbnb and VRBO and doing the re-rental strategy, there was a ton of demand for short-term rentals. It was very easy to claim expenses on properties, and it was very simple because the algorithm was pushing so hard to the listings that were there. Now there's a lot more listings, and things have really changed in the market, especially here in Canada. Regulatory uncertainty. We've seen from the Canadian government, and we've heard it on the news, and we hear the general sentiment that housing is a giant issue. And what we've seen recently is the government actually coming and trying to step in between the consumer and the supplier to actually change the demand and change the supply of these services and products to be on the market. We've seen things change like zoning requirements. A lot of cities now require short-term rental licensing, which is just another cost that gets added to your cost basis when it comes to running short-term rentals, but it's also a step in the wrong direction when it comes to how to actually own and operate these things. When I got started, there was no such thing as licensing for having short-term rentals in our cities. Now, there were issues, but most of those issues can be addressed by the existing bylaws. Things like noise complaints. That's a big issue for the community where you have your short-term rentals. Things like these licensing products, all it does is it serves to limit the actual availability of the investor to start a new listing in a market. Another thing that it serves to do is actually alienate and sort of create a negative impression or negative stereotype against the short-term rental strategy. One of the big things I wanted to focus on is the actual uncertainty about where it ends. Does it just end with licensing? Or do you think that the market's going to change in such a way that short-term rentals become completely illegal? I actually think we're closer to being on the path of them becoming illegal or extremely limited than we are closer to the path where it's totally free market and you have the ability to decide what to charge for your rental, how you can book it out, and minimum stays. We also saw market considerations in the last few years with things like COVID. We saw very quickly that the government can step in and just decide whether or not you can continue to rent that space. They actually put a freeze on short-term rentals in Ontario. So my short-term rentals, we just weren't able to run them anymore. And that's a pretty scary thing when it comes to an investment proposal. So I think one thing we really have to consider when it comes to short-term rentals is if you are going to continue running them, you should really be thinking about what are my strategies here on how to pivot if the market shifts? What if regulation gets put in place? What if they tell me I can't do it at all? And the big question I have for you is when you purchased that property, how did you run your numbers? Because a lot of people I've seen in the last few years are running their numbers by assuming that they can get a lot more revenue through an active strategy like short-term rentals than they can from a long-term rental approach. But as we've seen over the last couple of years, rates have doubled. Actually, rates have even almost tripled in a lot of places. If you ran your numbers with the expectation that you can get a lot more rental income from that short-term rental, and now it becomes illegal or heavily regulated in such a way that those numbers don't exist anymore, how is your rental going to perform? These are real questions that you need to ask yourself as an investor, and you need to, at the very least, even if you decide to continue doing this strategy or you enter the market with that strategy, that's fine. But you need to run your numbers with exit strategies in mind. Because the problem is, when you have to exit is generally speaking the time when other people have to exit too. And so what ends up happening is we get a lot more supply coming onto the market and things that tend to sit. Right now, with rates being the way they are, with inflation the way that it is, and with regulations being so tight, buildings are sitting for longer. There's downward pressure on price. And what happens to you as an investor is if they decide that this strategy is not going to be valid anymore, if they decide that the housing crisis is such an important thing for our society that we must heavily regulate short-term rentals or make them illegal altogether, how's your cash flow? Okay, if you turn off that tap, what's it going to look like for you? If you look to list, you're probably looking at sitting on the market for months at a time. If you look to pivot your strategy, I need you to know that the rental income is not going to be the same. Now, as rents are going up, it's going to help you, but that can't be your lifeline if you ran your numbers at short-term rental rates. Long-term rent's just not the same because it's not an active strategy. Another thing that's been changing in the market is the regulations regarding expense claims, okay? In Canada, or at least in Ontario, it's going the direction where expenses can no longer be claimed on your actual operating. What that means is things like your cleaning supplies, things like your actual cleaner, things like your toilet paper, towels, all those consumables, sheets even, all those consumables that these rentals go through fairly regularly are no longer going to be able to be claimed for tax purposes. I'm hoping that this video serves to be just a jumping off point, a starting point for you to consider this strategy and think critically about what is possible if these regulations continue. I think if we continue to see the sentiment that we do in society today, that housing crisis is a big problem that's not getting solved anytime soon, that landlords are bad. If landlords are bad, short-term rental landlords are the worst, okay? I think you need to take that into consideration when you're thinking about entering the market as a short-term rental. And then I think you really need to be looking at your circumstances right now and thinking, if you already have these rentals, is it worth it? Okay, is it worth the added expense now that you can't write that off? Is it worth the added management time? Is it worth it if they continue to add expenses as well in the form of regulation? And that's all I wanted to talk to you guys about today. If you have comments about this, if you have thoughts about this subject matter, please, let's start a discussion in the comments below, because I want to continue talking about this and hear from those of you that have been successful in pivoting, in adapting, and overcoming some of the challenges that you've seen in the recent years. And I would also love to hear from you as well if you've had struggles with these changes. If you're struggling with these changes, drop a comment below. I'm sure one of our viewers has dealt with some of the issues that you're dealing with right now, and they can help you. And if you've totally failed, leave a comment as well, because your failures, your stories here can serve as wisdom for the next person who's considering this investment strategy but doesn't know yet what they don't know. So please help out your fellow Canadians, drop a comment below. Let's start a discussion here and let's talk about whether or not it's time to exit short-term rentals.